In this lecture, we will be talking about consumer and producer surplus, a measure of economic welfare. Now, I want to make it very clear that when we talk about economic welfare in microeconomics, we are not talking about the word welfare the way we use in day-to-day popular media. Here, the word economic welfare has nothing to do with the poverty programs or any kind of social welfare programs. When we talk about economic welfare in microeconomics, we are primarily talking about the welfare that goes to the individuals for participating in the market process of buying and selling. Now you might be wondering, what does it mean to be participant in a market process? We all do participate in a market process, because anytime you are paying somebody to buy something, you are engaging in an exchange process, which is a market. Now the question is this: what does this welfare means then in microeconomics? So to understand those concepts, first let's talk about a couple of definitions. So first concept we'll be talking about is something called consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is a measure of the benefits of the participation in the market for consumers. So if a consumer or the buyer engages or buys something in the market, the benefit that the person receives is known as consumer surplus. Now just to give you the idea, what does it mean? It means that suppose I have $50, and we all know there's an opportunity cost of buying something, because I have to give up my $50 to get something. Suppose I dearly want a coat which is selling for say $50. However, in my mind, that coat might have a value of $75, because I might be willing to pay up to $75 for that coat, but I am receiving it for $50 because that the seller is charging. Obviously, I'm not going to go out and tell the seller, hey, I'm willing to pay $75, because nobody does that. Because I would like to pay as little as possible for the coat which I personally value at $75. So when I buy the coat at $50, but my personal own valuation or something called willingness to pay is $75, that means I'm getting a benefit of $25, which is nothing but the difference between the willingness to pay, that's $75, and the actual price I am paying, which is $50. So that's why in consumer surplus is nothing but the difference between willingness to pay and the actual price. Now, what is this willingness to pay? Is the price one willing to pay, which can be much higher than the price which is charged by the seller. And what is this price? Which is the often called the market price, which is the market price. So market price is the price that is the seller is charging right now, and whatever the gap between the price that you are willing to pay and the price that seller is charging is your consumer surplus. Or in a more technical way, it also means consumer surplus is measured by the area below the demand curve and above the price. So let's try to discuss the idea of economic or welfare or consumer surplus using a demand graph. So since consumers means demand, so let's draw this. Let's say this is the market for coats. So it's the quantity of coats, and this is the price of coats. And let's say a demand curve looks like this. This is the demand for coats, and suppose the market price is say $50. That's the market price for coat. Now suppose you are a person who is willing to pay up to $75 for this coat, and say you just want to buy one coat and you are willing to pay up to $75. That's your willingness to pay. And what's the gap between this 75 and 50? This is your consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve, which is the demand curve, and the market price. So this area up here, this triangle, represents the consumer surplus. So it will become clearer when we'll do a couple of more examples. So in this particular example, if you look at consumer surplus at price P1 on this diagram A at price P1, so your consumer surplus is the area ABC, is your consumer surplus. So let's try to understand this using another diagram in B, where suppose there's a price changes, that means price decreases from P1 to P2. So it decreases from P1 to P2. So this is your initial consumer surplus. Now because price decrease, more people can afford it. So there's a gain in consumer surplus, which is shown by this area BDEC. So this is the area BDEC. This is the gains to the existing customers, or the gains that they'll receive, because now they have to pay a lower price P2, which is lower than what they were willing to pay before. Even P1 was the previous market price. Willing to pay, some of them are willing to pay up to price here and up to point A. And this triangle CEF, this is the triangle CEF, that's the consumer surplus for new consumers. That means the new people who are able to now buy it. So quantity demanded increases from Q1 to Q2. According to law of demand, as price decreases, quantity demand increases. Now let's do the similar kind of exercise for the sellers, because in a market there's a buyers, there's a sellers. So we'll have similar thing for the sellers. So what is the benefit of market participation for the seller? It's called producer surplus. So producer surplus is the difference between the firm's revenue and the marginal cost of every unit, but it does not allow for the fixed cost. It is closely related to firm's profit, but is not quite the same thing. Very important. So basically what it shows is the difference between what the price that you are charging and pretty much the minimum price that you are willing to charge for the same product. And often the minimum price that you are willing to charge is called marginal cost pricing, because marginal cost is the additional cost that you are incurring to sell the product. So you want to make sure that additional cost is recuperated. So how do we show it? Producer surplus is nothing but price. This is the market price. So let's use a different color. So this is your market price. And what is W2A? This is your willingness to accept. Accept a price which you are willing to sell. And how do we capture producer surplus? Producer surplus is measured by the area above the supply curve and below the price. So it's the same idea as demand, but it's just the flip. It's for the supply. So in this diagram, in the first diagram, diagram A, you can see here that producer surplus is captured by this area. So P1 is the market price. So this area A, B, and C. So A, B, and C, that's the producer surplus, which is the gap between the market price and the minimum price that the person is willing to accept to sell the product. We'll do a similar exercise if price increases from P1 to P2. And we all know by the law of supply, as price increases, quantity supplied increases. It increases from Q1 to Q2. So as a result, there's an additional surplus to the existing sellers, which is BDEC, plus there's an additional surplus for the new sellers, which is CEF. So that's what goes to the additional sellers. So finally, we'll bring all this together in a demand supply diagram, which we'll call total welfare. So total welfare is also known as economic welfare. So let's try to write it down. So total welfare is also called economic welfare, which is nothing but the summation of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And that's the benefit that goes to the buyers and sellers to participate in a market process. And how do we show all these things? If you look into this diagram, this is your demand, this is your supply, wherever the market price is, which is at the equilibrium. And so this area ACE is the economic welfare or total welfare that's going to the market participant. So the easiest way to visualize economic welfare is that just add up consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So consumer surplus is the benefit that's going to the buyers, and producer surplus is the benefit that's going to seller to participate in a market process. And this is very important aspect of microeconomics, because this is how we are going to compare different policies, because policies, whether certain things are policies are good or bad, depend on what is the distribution of welfare and how that welfare getting distributed across different interest groups.